Okay, it's part 7. Number 3, indigenous people have the right to be actively involved in developing and in determining development programs affecting them, and as far as possible, to administer such programs through their own institutions. 4, capital S states, that is mean capital S, lowercase t a, lowercase t e s, states, shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous people concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources. 5, indigenous people have the right to effective measures to mitigate adverse ecological, economic, social, cultural, or spiritual impact for the implementation of development projects that affect their rights. Indigenous people have been deprived of their own means of subsistence and development, have the right to restitution, and where there is not possible, to fair and equitable compensation. This includes the right to compensation for any damage caused to them by the implementation of lower spelled state, international financial institutions, or private business plans, programs, or projects. Then it has down here, okay. Article 30, right to peace, security, and protection. 1, indigenous people have the right to peace and security. 2, indigenous people have the right to recognition and respect for their institutions, for the maintenance of their organization and control of its communities and peoples. 3, indigenous people have the right to protection and security in situations or periods of internal or international armed conflicts pursuant to the international humanitarian law. 4, capital spelled states, in compliance with international agreements to which they are party, in particular international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1494 relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, and Protocol 2 of 1977 relating to the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts. In the event of the armed conflicts, shall take adequate measures to protect the human rights institutions, lands, territories, and resources of the indigenous people and their communities. Likewise, states: A, shall not recruit indigenous children and adolescents into the armed forces under any circumstances. B, shall take measure of effective reparation and provide adequate resources for the same, and jointly with indigenous people affected, for the damages incurred caused by an armed conflict. C, shall take special and effective measures in collaboration with indigenous peoples to guarantee that indigenous women, children, live free from all forms of violence, especially sexual violence, and shall guarantee the right to access to justice, protection, and effective reparations for damages incurred to the victims. 6, military activities shall not take place in the lands or territories of indigenous people unless justified by a relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by the indigenous people concerned. Section 6, General Provisions, Article 31. Alright, let's see. 1, the states, lowercase states, shall ensure the full enjoyment of the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of indigenous peoples, as well as their right to maintain their cultural identity, spiritual and religious traditions, worldview, values, and the protection of their religious and cultural sites and human rights contained in this declaration. It has 3. The State of Colombia breaks with consensus as regards Article 30, Paragraph 5 of the OAS Declaration of Indigenous People, since according to the mandate contained in the. All right. 2. The lowercase states shall promote with full and effective participation of the indigenous people the adoption of the legislative and other measures that may be necessary to give effect to the rights included in this declaration. Article 32. All rights and freedoms recognized in the present declaration are guaranteed equally to indigenous women and men. Article 33. Indigenous peoples and persons have the right to effective and appropriate remedies, including prompt judicial remedies for the reparation of all violations of their collective and individual rights. The lowercase states, with full and effective participation of indigenous people, shall provide the necessary mechanisms for the exercise of this right. Article 34. In case of conflicts and disputes with indigenous people, lowercase states shall provide with full and effective participation of those peoples just, equitable, and effective mechanisms and procedures for their prompt resolution. For this purpose, due consideration and recognition shall be given to the customs, traditions, norms, or legal systems of the indigenous people concerned. Article 35. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted so as to limit, restrict, or deny human rights in any way, or so as to authorize any action that is not in keeping with the international human rights law. Article 36. In the exercise of the rights enunciated in the present declaration, human rights and fundamental freedoms of all shall be respected. The exercise of the rights set forth in this declaration shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law and in accordance with international human rights obligations. Any such limitation shall be non-discriminatory and strictly necessary solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and for meeting the just and most compelling requirements of a democratic society. Let's see here. The provisions set forth in this declaration shall be interpreted in accordance with the principle of justice. It says democracy, respect for human rights, equity, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. Article 37. Indigenous people have the right to have access to financial and technical assistance from the capital states and through international cooperation for the enjoyment of the rights contained in this declaration. Let's see. Article 38. The Organization of American Capital States, its organs, agencies, and entities shall take all necessary measures to promote the full respect, protection, and application of the rights of indigenous people contained in this declaration, and shall endeavor to ensure their efficiency. Efficacy. Article 38. The nature and scope of the measures that shall be taken to implement this declaration shall be determined in accordance with the spirit and purpose of said declaration. Article 39. Nothing in this declaration shall be construed as diminishing or extinguishing rights that indigenous people now have or may acquire in the future. Article 41. The rights recognized in this declaration, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous people of the Americas. All right, so that's The American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Shalom.